the soft hum of conversation filled the elegant restaurant. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of business meetings, first dates, and quiet celebrations blending into the background of dim lighting and pristine white tablecloths. It was the kind of place where the wealthy dined without thinking about the cost, where the staff moved with quiet efficiency, anticipating the needs of their patrons before they were even spoken. James Jim Walker sat alone at a corner table, his posture straight, his movements slow but deliberate. A man who had lived a life of discipline and carried it with him even now. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He didn't care about the high society types that filled the place, nor did he care if they looked at him and wondered whether he belonged. He had fought in wars before. This was just another room full of people who would never understand the sacrifices made so they could sit in comfort. He cut into his steak with the precision of someone who had learned to appreciate a good meal when it was in front of him. He had known hunger before. He had known what it meant to eat quickly before the next firefight, to savor nothing because tomorrow wasn't promised. Tonight, though, he had decided to treat himself, to enjoy a rare evening out. And then they walked in. The shift in energy was immediate. The waitstaff tensed. Conversations dimmed just slightly before picking back up again, but not before people took note of who had entered. Richard Caldwell, the CEO of one of the biggest real estate firms in the city. A man who was used to power, used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. He wasn't just rich. He liked people to know he was rich. His presence carried arrogance, from the tailored three-piece suit to the Rolex gleaming under the restaurant's golden lights. He strode in like he owned the place, a handful of high-profile associates trailing behind him, laughing at something that wasn't funny, but was important enough to pretend it was. The maitre d' greeted him with the kind of rehearsed politeness that came from serving men like him too many times. "Mr. Caldwell, welcome back. Your usual table?" Richard waved his hand dismissively, already looking around as if scanning the restaurant for anything that might offend his sense of status. His gaze barely glanced over the businessmen, the couples, the regular elite who dined there often. But then, his eyes landed on Jim. The moment stretched. Jim didn't look up right away. He kept cutting into his steak, chewing thoughtfully, like he hadn't just been marked as an issue. Richard's smile curled slightly, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Hey," he said, loud enough for his group to hear, "I didn't realize this place started serving at the VA cafeteria." A few quiet chuckles from his associates, though some looked uncomfortable. Jim's fork paused for a second. Then he picked it up again, took another bite. Didn't acknowledge him, didn't flinch. And somehow, that made it worse. Richard's smirk faltered. He didn't like being ignored. He was the kind of man who had never been ignored in his life. He moved closer to Jim's table, resting one hand on the chair across from him, like he was about to take a seat, though he had no intention of doing so. "You lost, old man?" he asked, still smiling, though now it was sharper, more pointed. "Because this isn't exactly a soup kitchen." Jim took a slow sip of his water, completely unfazed. He didn't look up until he was done, placing the glass back down with precision. Then, finally, his eyes met Richard's. Calm. Cold. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The kind of stare that had once belonged to a man who had been shot at, who had seen men die, who had walked away from things Richard could never comprehend. Richard opened his mouth to speak again, but Jim finally responded, voice even. "Just eating my dinner." Richard scoffed, glancing at the maitre d', then back at Jim. "Right. Well, maybe you ought to find somewhere a little more appropriate." His gaze flicked down to Jim's clothes, not tattered, not dirty, but not designer either. Places like this, they're meant for people who can actually afford to be here. Jim didn't smile, didn't blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded bill, and placed it on the table, enough to cover his meal. More than enough. Then he stood, adjusting his jacket, his movements slow, measured. For a second, it seemed like that was it. Like Jim was going to do what men like him always did. Take the disrespect, let it roll off, move on. And maybe, if Richard had just left it there, that's exactly what would have happened. But Richard smirked, taking one last shot. "That's right, walk away," he said, voice smug. "Always knew your type didn't belong here." And just like that, the restaurant fell silent. Because this time, Jim wasn't the one who reacted. A waiter near the bar stiffened. A bartender froze, jaw tightening. A busboy, no older than 20, clenched his fists. And then, the head chef stepped out from the kitchen. A tall man in his 40s, his arms lined with faded military tattoos, his gaze locked on Richard like he had just crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "You need to leave," Richard blinked, turning. "Excuse me?" The chef didn't hesitate. "I said, you need to leave." His voice was sharp, final. Richard scoffed, looking around as if expecting someone to come to his defense. But the maitre d' was staring at the floor. The servers were standing still, watching. Then, another voice. "I quit." It came from the bartender. He tore off his apron and tossed it onto the bar. Then, another. A waitress set down her notepad. "Me too." The busboy dropped his towel. And just like that, the entire staff started walking out. Richard's confidence cracked. "Wait, what the hell do you people think you're doing?" The chef stepped closer, and for the first time, Richard took a step back. "This man fought for this country," the chef said, nodding at Jim. "Men like him fought for your right to sit in this restaurant and act like an arrogant prick. And if this place is going to throw out a veteran just so some corporate jackass can feel important, then none of us want to work here." More murmurs. A few customers stood up watching. Richard turned red, his jaw clenching. "You're making a mistake." The chef smirked. "Number? We're finally doing something right." Jim adjusted his cap, watching the entire thing unfold, then turned to the chef and gave a single, respectful nod. Then, with quiet dignity, he walked out the door, and behind him, half the restaurant followed. The door swung shut behind Jim, the cool night air settling against his skin as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The hum of the city stretched around him, horns blaring in the distance, pedestrians moving along the streets, neon lights flickering against polished storefronts. But inside that restaurant, a reckoning was unfolding. Jim had walked away with the same quiet dignity he had carried his whole life. He didn't make a scene, didn't argue, didn't demand anything, not respect, not justice, not even common decency. Because men like him didn't need to. The weight of his presence had done enough, had stirred something in people, and now, the real fight was happening without him. Inside, Richard Caldwell was losing his grip. "Everyone just calm down," he snapped, his face flushed with disbelief as he looked around the restaurant, eyes darting from the chef to the departing staff, to the guests who were starting to murmur among themselves. Some still sat at their tables, wide-eyed. Others had pushed back their chairs, watching the chaos unfold with fascination. A few even stood, reaching for their coats, shaking their heads at the way the night had turned. The manager, a thin man in his late 50s with gray at his temples, was sweating. He had spent years bending over backward for men like Richard, smoothing over their tantrums, fixing whatever mess their egos created. But tonight, there was no fixing this. The chef, still standing firm, arms crossed, wasn't budging. "You heard me," he said. "Get out." Richard scoffed, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, you think you can throw me out? Do you even know who I am?" The chef's face didn't change. "Yeah," he said. "You're the guy who's about to eat somewhere else." Laughter. Real laughter. A burst from the bartender, a chuckle from a group near the bar. Even one of Richard's own colleagues smirked before quickly hiding it. Richard's jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. He had never been disrespected like this before. Not in public, not like this. Not by the people he considered beneath him. His voice turned sharp, biting. "This restaurant has a reputation, and if you think I'm gonna sit here and let some blue-collar..." A sharp crack echoed through the room as the chef slammed his kitchen knife down onto the counter. The room went silent. The chef leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his fingers flexing against the steel handle. "The only reputation that matters is how you treat people, and right now, everyone in this place is seeing exactly what kind of man you are." Richard opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The restaurant had turned on him. The bartender grabbed his jacket, slung it over his shoulder, and turned to the chef. "Wherever you work next, let me know. I'm in." The waitress who had been serving Richard's table untied her apron, tossing it onto the nearest chair. "Same here." The busboy, barely out of his teens, straightened his back. I'd rather wash dishes in a gas station than serve people like him. And then, one by one, they walked out. Not just the staff, customers too. A woman near the back, dressed in an expensive black gown, shook her head as she stepped away from her table. "This is disgusting," she muttered under her breath. "That veteran sat there minding his business and you threw him out like trash. I'll never eat here again." Another man, a lawyer in his mid-40s, folded his napkin and placed it neatly on his plate. "Same. This place is dead to me." It kept happening. People who had come in expecting a fine dining experience were leaving mid-meal. Men and women who had once looked at Richard Caldwell with admiration were now avoiding his gaze, because they had seen him for who he really was, and they wanted nothing to do with him. Richard stood frozen, watching as his power unraveled in real time, his fists clenched, his mind racing for a way to fix this, to control the damage, to put everything back in its place. But it was too late. The damage was done. He turned to the manager, eyes blazing. "Do something!" The manager, still pale, still sweating, shook his head. "You did this to yourself, sir." The words cut deeper than they should have, because they were true. By the time the exodus was over, half the tables sat empty. The once bustling restaurant reduced to a hollow shell. The hum of conversation had been replaced with a dead, suffocating silence. And Richard Caldwell, for the first time in his life, felt small. Outside, Jim Walker walked down the street, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't need to look back, because he already knew. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and tonight, a lesson had been served. Jim walked down the city street, the neon glow of the restaurants and shops reflecting off the wet pavement beneath his boots. He didn't walk fast, didn't rush. There was no need. Men like him didn't run from things. They let the world catch up to them when it was ready. The restaurant was already behind him, but he knew that inside, Richard Caldwell was drowning. Jim had seen that look before, the realization that you're not as powerful as you thought. It happened to arrogant young officers in the field, men who thought their rank meant something until the bullets started flying and real leadership was needed. Jim had been there before, standing in the dirt, watching a man's ego crumple when the weight of reality finally caught up to him. But Caldwell wasn't on a battlefield. No, he was standing in the middle of a high-end restaurant, surrounded by empty tables and abandoned plates, watching his power disappear like smoke in the wind. Jim didn't need to see it happen. He already knew exactly how it was unfolding. Richard's face red with rage, eyes darting across the nearly deserted restaurant, desperate to reclaim control. His expensive suit, once a symbol of untouchable status, now just another reminder that money couldn't buy respect. The staff had walked out. The customers had followed, and now Richard Caldwell was standing alone in the ruins of his own arrogance. Back inside the restaurant, Richard was still standing at the center of it all, his hands shaking at his sides, his mind racing for a way to fix it. The manager was avoiding his gaze, staring at the exit like he was thinking about walking out himself. The maitre d' had already slipped away, not wanting to be anywhere near what was coming next. Richard turned to the remaining customers, the few who had hesitated, who weren't sure if they wanted to be a part of the exodus. He forced a laugh, trying to play it off, pretending like he was still in control. "Well," he said, voice tight, "looks like we just lost a few weak-minded employees. Guess we'll be hiring soon." No one laughed. A man in his 50s, still seated at a table near the window, set down his glass of wine and looked up. His expression wasn't amused. It wasn't even angry. It was something worse. Disgust. "You really don't get it, do you?" the man said. Richard's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" The man stood up, reaching for his jacket. "This isn't about your employees. This isn't about business. It's about who you are." He adjusted his cufflinks, looking around at the emptying restaurant. And tonight, everyone saw it. Richard clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. He turned toward the bar, where a single bartender was still standing, polishing a glass, his face unreadable. "Pour me a drink," Richard snapped. The bartender didn't move. Richard's nostrils flared. "I said pour me a damn drink." The bartender sighed, set down the glass, and calmly removed his apron. "Nah, I think I'm done too." He tossed the apron onto the counter and walked out, not sparing Richard another glance. Richard's hands were shaking now. He could feel the pressure building behind his eyes. the humiliation burning his throat. He wanted to scream, to demand that someone fix this, that someone make this right. But there was no one left to listen. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He yanked it out, his fingers fumbling as he saw the caller ID. His business partner, probably already hearing about what happened. Maybe from someone in the restaurant, maybe from someone on social media. It didn't matter, the damage was done. He answered, forcing his voice to stay calm. Yeah? A pause. Then, the voice on the other end, clipped and sharp. We need to talk, now. Richard swallowed hard, staring at the carnage around him. For the first time in his life, he had lost control, and the whole city was about to find out. Outside, Jim kept walking. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story, not looking back. Because there was no need. Richard stood alone in the near-empty restaurant, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. His suit, once pristine and perfectly tailored, now felt too tight, suffocating. His mind raced, grasping at something, anything, that would make this right, that would undo what had just happened. But there was nothing. No magic words, no last-minute fix. The damage was done. And worse, people had seen it. The phone in his hand felt heavier than it should. His business partner's voice still echoed in his ear. We need to talk. Now. He already knew what that meant. His public image, his entire persona, had been built on control, on power, on the illusion that he was above everyone else in the room, that he could walk into any space and own it. But tonight, a man who hadn't raised his voice, who hadn't thrown a punch, who hadn't even fought back, had dismantled him completely. Jim Walker. The name settled in Richard's mind like a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. He should have let it go, should have ignored the old man instead of trying to humiliate him, but he couldn't, because people like Richard didn't just ignore things that didn't fit into their world. He had pushed, and Jim hadn't needed to push back. The staff had done that for him. The customers had done that for him. Richard had been unmasked in front of everyone, and there was no putting the mask back on. His business partner's voice snapped him back to reality. Richard, are you listening to me? He cleared his throat, trying to force himself back into control. Yeah, he muttered. I'm here. You need to fix this. Do you realize how fast this is spreading? I've already had calls from 2 board members. By morning, this will be everywhere. Richard turned slowly, his eyes scanning the restaurant. The pristine white tablecloths, the polished silverware, the dim golden lights. It all looked the same, but the power in the room had shifted. It didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the story. He swallowed. I'll handle it. Richard. His business partner's voice dropped into something colder, something dangerous. We can't afford another PR disaster. If this gets out of hand, I said I'll handle it. His partner sighed. We'll see. The line went dead. Richard exhaled sharply, lowering the phone, staring at the blank screen like it held the answers. But there were no answers. Just fallout. The restaurant manager, who had stayed frozen in the background through the entire scene, cleared his throat. Richard looked up sharply, his temper flaring. What? The man hesitated, shifting his weight. His nerves were clear, but there was something else there now. A new kind of tension, the kind that came when a man realized he wasn't afraid anymore. I just got a call, the manager said carefully, from corporate. Richard's stomach twisted. And they want you gone. For a second, the world stopped. The restaurant, the lights, the sounds of the city outside, it all seemed to blur at the edges. His voice came out hoarse. You're firing me? The manager straightened his tie, exhaling slowly, finding his courage. Not me, the people above me. Richard's ears buzzed. His mouth went dry. His own restaurant. The place where he had built his empire, where he had demanded respect, where people had always bent over backward to please him. And now he was being thrown out of it. Effective immediately, the manager added, his voice almost apologetic, but not quite. You should probably leave. Richard couldn't move. Not yet. Because this couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not because of some old veteran in a cheap jacket and a stupid marine pin. But it was. and it had. The weight of it settled in his chest, a slow, crushing realization that this wasn't something he could out-talk, out-buy, or out-threaten. He had lost. Completely. His jaw clenched. He straightened his jacket, forced his spine to stay rigid, tried to pretend like he still had some dignity left. He turned toward the exit, stepping past the empty tables, past the waitstaff who were watching him now, with something between satisfaction and pity. He kept walking, but the weight followed him. By morning, this would be everywhere. By next week, he'd be a cautionary tale. Richard Caldwell, the CEO who had everything until he lost a fight he didn't even realize he was in. Jim Walker stepped into the quiet night, the city stretching out in front of him, the cool air wrapping around his skin. He walked the same way he always did, steady, unhurried, like a man who had nothing to prove. And somewhere behind him, in a restaurant that wasn't his problem anymore, a man who had spent his whole life climbing to the top was finally learning what it felt like to fall.